When we learn something new for the first time, for instance, just think about the first time you learned to ride a bike. I bet no one is succeeded in the first try, right? You practiced a lot of time to make the first step, but eventually you did succeed. In this video, I'm going to help you to understand the camera basics and you are going to practice many times to improve your photography skills. First, let's go with shutter speed. Shutter speed is kind of a door to a camera sensor that open and close when you click the shutter button. Now shutter speed is the rate of how fast the camera shutter opens and closes. So it determines the amount of light get into your sensor. Shutter speed has one more function. It controls the motion blur in the image. Longer shutter speed gives more motion blur, and the opposite is shorter shutter speed gives crispy image. So if you want to freeze the motion in your picture, try to take the picture in shorter shutter speed. Now let's go to the second basics, aperture. Aperture is the size of opening in your eyes, like the iris in your eye. Now the aperture number is the value of aperture opening. Lesser the aperture number, larger the opening will be, which means more space allows more light into the lens that hit the sensor. The second function of aperture is it affects the depth of field of an image. In simple words, aperture determines the blurriness in the background according to its value. Now we got shutter speed and aperture, but still this image looks darker, right? We need something to brighten them. There comes the ISO. ISO is the sensitivity of a sensor. If the sensor is more sensitive, the image will be brighter. To increase the sensitivity, you increase the ISO value. Now you might think, we got ISO, we can just increase the ISO to brighten the image, right? It doesn't work like that. DSLRs have certain limit of ISO range. If you add more ISO to the image, then it will look more grainy. So try to keep the ISO as low as possible to avoid the grains. ISO can be useful in some scenarios, especially in low lights. But remember, you can't just rely only on the ISO. That's why you need to compensate the exposure triangle. Exposure triangle is nothing but the combination of shutter speed, aperture and ISO. Photographers try to compensate the exposure triangle for the scene to get a good image. For example, if you are shooting in daylight to get a nice blurry background, you can open the aperture as much as you can, but to avoid more light to get into the sensor, keep the ISO low and increase the shutter speed. But remember, keep your ISO as the last option.